All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here on time on this Monday morning, our last lecture before fall break, which will be a well-deserved break for all of us. Hope everyone had a good weekend. I don't know if there was it was like the big homecoming reunion weekend, so I hope that everything's well. Congrats to the football team for cleaning up pretty good, and the field hockey team. Is anyone here on the field? Are you in the field hockey, Rod? Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, congrats. You guys had a shutout. Is that right? Nice job. Yeah, representing on homecoming weekend. We're gonna pick up, or actually not pick up, continue with the skull today. And yeah, well, here's our agenda. Well, before actually we get into the agenda, I want to remind everyone we've got a great seminar speaker coming tomorrow night. She's from OSU Marion, talking about sexual selection in these what she calls charismatic microfauna, which I love. So small invertebrates, arthropods there. The seminar is at 4:10 in the Science Center. I know it's right before fall break, but I'm really trying to get people out. So tell your friends that it's cool to go because friends are susceptible to that kind of peer pressure. Also, there's going to be snacks and drinks, and the last couple of seminars have gone really well. I know some of you have been there, and they've been really engaging, and speakers have been great. So please make every effort to attend. I think it'll be a really good one. All right, on to class. We're going to start off today with a review question and some drawing because I know that you wanted to do that first thing Monday morning. We're going to continue with the skull and we do a few more review activities mixed in there. At the end of class, I'm going to hand back quiz 3, or at least present your grades for quiz 3 and talk about that. And then just some reminders and a ticket out today and reminders about your lab quiz tomorrow. That's the plan. What questions do you have? All right, let's do some drawing. So as best you can from memory, go ahead and draw a lateral view of the skull. And you can make it facing left or right, doesn't matter. And label the following bones. So we will have a chance to review the diagram and make sure you've got this. But to start, at least, just jog your memory. See which of these bones you can pull up from the depths of your memory from Friday's lecture. And the skull is surprisingly hard to draw. It doesn't look like you. It doesn't look as many times as we've seen like a diagram or a picture of a skull in our lives. It doesn't look like we think it looks. Yeah, that's my job. I mean, that's what I do. I would draw something that looks similar. I'm seeing lots of drawings still happening. So we'll take an extra minute beyond the 2 minutes you see here. I don't want you to be rushed. So you just look down, you wear the perfect shirt for today's class. Yeah. Did you like that? Yeah. I gotta get one of those I could wear on this. Yeah, that'd be great. We should coordinate outfits more often time. Mhm. Okay, we'll do that. Skull shirt day. Let's take another 30 seconds. We'll have a chance to finish up. I'm going to show you the diagram so you can review in a second. If you get to the point where you're just stuck and you can't remember anything else, then go ahead and consult your notes. You can add to it. But again, try to do as much as you can from memory. All right, so here is what a skull looks like from the lateral view. And I asked you to draw and label the 8 cranial bones. Now remember, 2 of those bones are paired. So there's 2 parietal bones and 2 temporal bones. So go ahead and look at this against your own diagram. See what you got right, see what you didn't get right, see what you need to review. The couple pieces that are tricky, generally I'm guessing most of you got the occipital bone probably back here. Most of you probably got the parietal bones. Most of you probably got the frontal bone. Where it gets a little bit more convoluted is you've got the temporal bone in here, and it's really funky shape. Remember, you've got it has the sutures with the occipital bone here, and with the parietal bone kind of in this almost semicircle shape. And then you've got this little bit of the sphenoid bone poking through right here. And we left off lecture on Friday talking about the sphenoid bone, and we're going to pick up with that. Now, from this angle, this sphenoid bone looks almost like just this rectangular piece. But you're going to see that it's this actually really kind of complicated shaped bone that fits right in the center between the cranial bone and the facial bones. You'll have a chance to revisit this diagram a little bit later in class. For right now, do you have any questions on it? Okay. This slide is just to remind you that there's a study guide available, Google Slides document. If you need the QR code to access that, it's right here. Again, this is not something I'm going to collect or ever look at. It's just a resource for you with some of these diagrams so you have them all in one place. So let's continue talking about the skull, as I mentioned, with this the sphenoid bone, which is kind of one of my favorites because it's so weird. So this is the posterior view of a sphenoid bone. So remember, in the lateral view, you're seeing this edge right here. You really can't see it from this view. This is the posterior view. So this is as if I was standing here and you were looking through the occipital bone and the parietal bones in the back of my head, looking through my brain, and you would see something that looks like this. Now, it is, as I mentioned, it's kind of this oddly shaped bone, but it has these different processes coming off of a central body. And I want to talk about those, what those processes are and why they're important. So the first thing I'll start with is the body of the sphenoid. This is the kind of larger chunk of bone in the middle off which all of these processes come. And then we have a couple features. We have the lesser wing, which is right here. It's this little protuberance that comes out here. And then you have the greater wing, which is the wing that's bigger, not surprisingly. Notice that the lesser wing and the greater wing don't touch. There's actually a fissure that goes through here. The way the angle is, this kind of looks like it overlaps, but this is a continuous fissure that goes right through here. So you've got the lesser wing, the greater wing. Then you have these funky pieces coming down here that are called your pterygoid processes. And those articulate with some of your facial bones. And some of the features that are between these processes have names as well. And specifically, I want to draw your attention to this guy right here. This is the superior orbital fissure. So this is directly behind the eye socket. So to orient you again, this bone, remember, this is as if you're looking at me from behind, looking through my occipital and parietal bones, through my brain. You're going to see this. And that orbital fissure, if we look at it from the other side in the context of your skull, so this is obviously an anterior view of your skull, that's this slit right here. So this is going to be the greater wing, this is the lesser wing, and you have this, this slit between those two where that forms this fissure in the back of the eye socket. I just want to orient you to where those pieces are. We'll look at those in a little more detail when we get to the facial bones and talk about the eye socket, but it helps to understand where those pieces are when we look at the sphenoid bone. So you should know all of the features on here labeled in red. And again, we'll see this in lab in a few weeks, but I'm covering it now in lecture. So it's going to be a little bit off. The timing's a little bit off. We're covering this before we get to the section in lab. But I think that you'll be able to put those pieces together. The sphenoid bone is called the keystone bone because it is central in the cranium and kind of in the entire skull between the facial bones as well. And you can see this, especially when you look at a superior view. So this is as if the skull is cut along a transverse plane. You can see this bone right here. What's this bone in brown? Occipital. Yep. And then what's this big hole called? Foramen magnum. Good. And then we have the sphenoid bone. Notice it's articulating with your occipital bone here. It's articulating with your temporal bones here. It's articulating with the bone, your facial bones here, and we'll talk about those in just a second. Another important feature of the sphenoid bone from the superior view is this thing called the sella turcica. It's so called the sella turcica because it comes from the words for a saddle, a Turkish saddle. Apparently it resembles the saddles that Turks would put on their horses. I don't know about that. But the sella turcica is this kind of cup-shaped structure right here. And inside of there on the bottom, the kind of flat part on the bottom is called the hypophyseal fossa. And that is where your pituitary gland, AKA your hypophysis, sits. And so it's this important little structure that nestles this very important gland associated with kind of a bridge between your nervous system and your endocrine system. We'll talk about the pituitary in detail later in class. For right now, I just want you to know the structure where it sits. And if we look at a skull cut along the along a coronal, along a frontal plane here, you can see the sella turcica right here. You can see it's this little cup-shaped structure in the sphenoid bone. Your pituitary sits right there and does all its pituitary things kind of safely nestled in there. Got you. Yeah, so that your parietal bone is actually going to be, you can actually see part of it here in pink. And actually this bone that's cut is your parietal bone. So that's kind of coming up and over like this. So like, yeah, it's the sphenoid bone is kind of right in the center of your skull. And you can see that, let me just orient you here. If you look here, you can see there is actually a little bit of articulation there. But the frontal bone and the parietal bone kind of form this dome that goes over the sphenoid bone. Does that answer your question, Jim? Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you. All right. Let me see here. You can see from this angle as well, the greater wing and the lesser wing. I mentioned the fissure is right there. And don't forget too, we have the anterior cranial fossa formed primarily by your frontal bone. Then you have your middle cranial fossa here formed by the sphenoid bone, the temporal bone. And of course, you have the posterior cranial fossa would be down here, formed primarily by the occipital bone. Couple other features that you should know in the sphenoid bone includes these four kind of holes or openings or passageways, I guess better said. There's the optic canal through which your optic nerve passes. A couple other features, the foramen rotundum, the foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum. The first two, the foramen rotundum and foramen ovale, are passageways for cranial nerves. Notice that these cranial nerves are given these Roman numerals. There's 12 of them. Later in the semester, we'll talk about those. You don't need to know which nerve it is and what the numbers are. I'm just kind of have those up there now. What I want you to know is that these are holes through which these cranial nerves pass. And then this last one, the one down here that's kind of formed right at the suture between the sphenoid bone and the temporal bone, is the passageway through which an important artery, your meningeal artery, passes. So remember, we have this protective casing around your brain that's very solid, but at the same time, stuff needs to go in and out from your brain. Primarily, we need passageways for nerves, so your brain can send and receive signals, and we need passageways for blood vessels, so your brain can send or can receive oxygen and nutrients and get rid of waste products. Can also see a cool feature here. I brought this up on the diagram earlier, but remember the superior orbital fissure right here? But this is between the lesser and greater wings of the sphenoid bone, looking through the eye socket there. And that fissure is important because actually 3 different nerves pass through there, and they are responsible for innervating the muscles of the eye. So your eye has this super complex set of muscles around it that we probably won't get into too much detail in this class. We'll talk about it a little bit in lab, but it's a little beyond the scope of what we cover in here, unfortunately. But there's all of these different muscles, and your eye is one of the most like precise, fine-tuned instruments on your body. And I don't just mean its ability to receive light signals, I mean its ability to move and track things. And your pupil needs to dilate and contract and close. And then your eye, of course, can move in a very, very fine-tuned way and look in all directions. It's this really kind of cool setup. And the nerves to control those muscles pass through that orbital fissure. So if we look at the sphenoid bone from a posterior view, it looks like this. This is where I started with. So posterior view, again, looking through the back of my head at this bone. Remember the greater, lesser wing, the body, and the pterygoid process. If we flip this around and look at it from the superior view, we have this. Here we can see this important feature, the sella turcica right here. And again, that's where your pituitary gland sits. And let's see, that's all I'm going to say about the sphenoid bone for the moment. Questions on it? Cool. All right, let's continue. The last of the cranial bones we'll cover is your ethmoid bone. This is another very, very oddly shaped bone that's kind of fit just anterior to your sphenoid bone. And it forms, it also articulates with your nasal bones, which we'll talk about in a second when we get to the facial bones. And it forms this kind of convoluted set of passageways through which air passes when you inhale through your nose. And you can see, if you look at an anterior view of the skull, you can barely see the ethmoid bone just here through the nasal opening, right? And you can see these 3 orange parts coming down. Those are part of the ethmoid bone that if we take everything else out, it looks like this. So what we saw in this diagram are these 3 structures of the ethmoid bone. I'm going to go back and show it to you in context. You can see those coming down right here. So the rest of the ethmoid bone sits squarely right behind the bridge of your nose. So if you took off your nasal bones right here and look kind of right through here, you'd be able to see your ethmoid bone. And it looks like a, I don't know, kind of like a walnut or something like that. It has all of these kind of convoluted structures that I'm going to walk you through kind of one by one. So, yes, Jada, go ahead.
So that I've broken some portion?
Not your ethmoid bones. Your ethmoid bone actually lies posterior to your septum, where you probably have, it's probably either the cartilage, and I'll show you this coming up when we talk about facial bones, or there's another bone called the vomer that makes up part of that septum between your 2 nares, your 2 passageways of your nose. So hang on to that thought. Later on today, we'll get to those bones and you'll see, but this guy is a little bit posterior, so it's not actually in the septum part of your nose, it's just behind it. Good question. So the first feature I want to point out, is called crista galli. This is a little like needle-like structure that points off just into the superior aspect of the ethmoid bone, so it's right on top, and it actually forms the important attachment point for something called the falx cerebri, which is this little string of connective tissue that helps anchor the brain. So it's a little brain anchor right here. And the tissue is attached to this, and then that attaches to the brain, and it keeps the brain is kind of within this cranial case. It's structured in there, but it's also kind of floating in there a little bit, like your brain can move around. It's got some leeway, which is why often, you know, if you get a concussion because you bang your head up front, you actually damage the brain in the rear, because what happens is that force of impact actually forces your brain and hits the back of the skull, and that's where you can get the damage. And this falx cerebri is this connective tissue that helps keep the brain kind of anchored, and it's anchored right to that structure on your ethmoid bone. We also have something called the cribriform plate. This forms the roof of the nasal cavities and the floor of your anterior cranial fossa. There are a bunch of foramina in there through which nerves pass as well. So you can see the cribriform plate here from the anterior view. I want to just go back and just structure this right here. Where are we here? So you can see in this diagram here, this would be this section right here, forming part of the anterior fossa of your of the skull. We've got the cribriform plate. We have what's called the ethmoidal labyrinth. And so we have a left and a right ethmoidal labyrinth. This is like filled with air cells. And what it does is these structures, I'll talk about this a little more later, but when you inhale, the air doesn't go in a straight line from inside your nose down to your lungs. Rather, it passes through these convoluted passageways, which creates turbulence, and increases the chances of that air coming into contact with your mucous membranes, so it can gob up any dust or pathogens or things like that before it gets to your lungs. So there's soft tissue covering all of these structures, and then there's mucus on top of that. And the idea here is that as your air passes through, it can basically filter it. We then have something called the middle nasal concha, which is part of that as well. And this extends into the nasal cavity. And here we have this epithelial tissue called olfactory epithelium that is highly innervated with specialized cells to detect scents. And finally, we have this structure down the middle that forms. So I guess, Jada, let me correct myself then. The most kind of superior posterior part of your nasal septum is formed by this part here. But chances are with the deviated septum, the issue is something more anterior to this. But I should correct myself. It does form part of that nasal septum all the way in the back. And you'll see the vomer actually articulates that. And then you have most of it is cartilage. So those are some structures you should, there's one more. Then we have the orbital plate. So this contributes to the eye socket and the orbit of the eye. And I'll show you this in context in just a second. So lots of structures on your ethmoid bone. It's pretty complicated. Make sure you're taking a look at diagrams of this in the book. And then also we will see this in lab. And actually the next slide here, Jada, is going to be perfect for you thinking about this. So this is a cut through frontal plane here, or not, excuse me, I said frontal, I think it's a mistake, I said frontal plane before, sagittal plane, you guys said that. Cut through the sagittal plane here. You can see part of the sphenoid bone here, you can see the telocella turcica, and then you can see part of the ethmoid bone here. Now, importantly, this is a parasagittal cut, so it's a little bit off center. So this, your septal cartilage and your vomer here are right down the middle. So if we actually did a true mid-sagittal plane here, it would cut right through the middle of this bone, and you wouldn't be able to see this side plate of the ethmoid bone. But you can see here, this is going to be your septum, formed primarily by the vomer, which we'll talk about. Then you have this in light purple here as cartilage, and then this kind of most superior posterior part of it is formed by that. What I want to show on this plate, this slide as well. And you can see what this looks like. So here's another parasagittal cut. This time it's kind of further past the mid-sagittal line, and you can see all of these kind of convoluted passageways through which air passes when you inhale through your nose. And you can see the ethmoid bone provides a structure for what's called the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha. And then the inferior nasal concha is actually its own bone. I'll talk about it in just a second. You can see this articulation. You've got the sphenoid bone here. You've got this guy, what's this guy called? The telocella turcica right here. You can see its articulation. We do a mid-sagittal cut right through the skull. We see something that looks like this, kind of putting it all together to see where all these bones lie. And so the ethmoid bone is going to be this guy right here. You can see it articulates with the sphenoid bone. You can see why the sphenoid bone is called the keystone bone. It's right in the center here. It articulates with the vomer, the ethmoid bone, the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the temporal bone, the occipital bone. It's doing a little bit of articulation with everybody. It's like the Missouri of the skull. Missouri borders something like 12 states or something like that. I think it's a state that borders the most other states, but I don't remember exactly the number. I think it's 12.
So, what if Voldemort's nose, like literally chopped off?
Yeah.
So like, when you just see his, what do you call it? The sphenoid bone, like sphenoid sinus that what we're seeing here, like Voldemort?
Yeah, so Voldemort's nose, he's mostly missing his soft tissue. I think his bones are still in place. So what you see is like, you would have cartilage that kind of comes out here a little bit. He's missing that, and he probably still has a nasal bone. And his ethmoid bone is would be probably in place too, because if he was missing that stuff, then he'd have like an actual hole in his face. He doesn't really have a hole, it's just kind of flat like that. So he probably has a decent skeleton, probably just missing the soft tissue, which is ironic. You think when they reconstituted him, it'd be harder to create the bone than the cartilage. Maybe because the bone is so highly vascularized, it was able to regenerate easier, whereas the cartilage, being largely avascular, was more difficult for them to make. Yeah, that's my conjecture anyway. I don't know if that's in the books or not. Cool. All right, let's go back to your diagram and go ahead and add these sutures onto that diagram. So you drew a diagram with the cranial bones. Go ahead and add the coronal suture, the squamous suture, the lambdoid suture, and the sagittal suture. I'll give you just a minute for this because you should have the diagram already. Just adding a couple parts to it. Where's Voldemort's nose? That's never come up in lecture before. All right, so going back to the diagram, this is what you drew earlier. You should have added the following labels here, and actually have more labels than you needed to add. Don't worry about some of the extra ones. But the squamous suture, remember, is this big kind of semicircle shaped suture between the parietal bone and the temporal bone. Then the lambdoid suture is this suture back here between the parietal and the occipital bone. Remember, it's lambdoid, it's kind of shaped like this inverted V. So we're seeing one side of it here and then comes back down the other side. Then we have the occipital mastoid suture back here between your temporal and occipital bone. I think, is that that's the fourth one? Am I missing one? Oh, coronal suture. So the coronal suture, oh, I didn't label it on here, my bad. Coronal suture is this guy right here, going in a coronal plane between the frontal bone and the parietal. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, did I put sagittal on there? Oh, but I didn't. Did I put coronal squamous lambdoid? Oh, I should have had the occipitomastoid suture. Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking that. And I apologize that it's you can't really see it. It would be right along the top of the skull there, right? So from this angle, you really can't see it. So that's my bad. I should have included occipitomastoid suture and not had parietal on there. So thanks for pointing that out. So there's 5 sutures altogether that you should know, including the coronal. Or not the coronal, the sagittal, midsagittal. Sagittal. Cool. Questions on those sutures? All right, we're going to continue talking about the facial bones then. So there's 14 bones of the 14 facial bones. 5 of them are in pairs. So there's 9 names you need to know. In other words, there's 5 pairs. That's 10 bones plus 4 more that are just single bones unpaired. You can see most of them from this angle right here. We can't see the palatines. I'll talk about those in a minute. we have these paired nasal bones, paired lacrimal bones. So the nasal bones form the superior most part of your nose. You can feel them right up here. You put your fingers there, and if you pinch the top of your nose and then gradually work towards the tip of your nose, you can feel that transition between the nasal bones, and you'll feel like a bump where those bones end, and then the cartilage of the end of your nose begins. And so that the end of your nose is all cartilage. The nasal bones only go down to like about there. You can see those here. Your lacrimal bones form the medial edge of the orbit of your eye, and they're right in here. You can actually feel those bones. They have a little feature where your tear ducts sit, and if you just go lateral from where you're pinching your nose before, you can feel those bones right in your eye socket, kind of right there. Lacrimal, of course, comes from the word for tears, so it's right in the corner of your eyes. The zygomatic bone is your cheekbone. You can feel this one right here very easily as well, just below your eye socket, kind of the inferior lateral margin of your eye socket. So these guys right here. Then you've got your maxilla, which is the kind of the middle part of your face here. You can see it surrounds the nasal cavity. There's pieces of it that kind of come up here and actually articulate with the frontal bone, and then it forms part of your cheekbones as well. And then of course the maxilla includes the upper jaw. So you have all of these articulations called gum fossees, which was on your quiz, that are the articulations of your teeth with the maxilla. You have the vomer, which is that bone that forms part of the septum of your nose right here. So here's the vomer, and here it's articulating with the perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone. You can see that right there. And then finally, you have the big old bone on the bottom called the mandible. And there's only one mandible bone. It's all a single bone. And again, that bone contains these gum fossees for your teeth of your lower jaw as well. And the mandible is the only bone in your skull that is freely movable. It's the only bone that has a diarthrotic joint that can freely move. Everything else is pretty much immovable. So let's walk through some of these. The maxillary bones, remember these are paired, so there's two of them, even though often it looks like it's just a single bone, but there's a suture down the middle. They bear the teeth in the upper jaw, as I mentioned, and there's a couple of different processes on the maxillary bones you should know. The frontal process is this part that goes up, remember it articulates all the way with the frontal bone up here. Your nasal bones are right there. You have the zygomatic process that forms part of your cheekbone and articulates with the zygomatic bones here. In this figure, it's kind of cut just so we can see the rest of it. And then we have the alveolar process. So this is where all the sockets for your teeth are. Remember those gum fossees, those special joints where your teeth are anchored with these ligaments into the bone. Then we have something called the palatine process. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a minute from a different angle. That forms part of your hard palate. So in the roof of your mouth, you have a soft palate anterior, and then and if you go back further posteriorly, it's formed by bone, and that's called the hard palate. You can feel that if you stick your finger in your mouth, but don't do that right now. Go wash your hands first. So there's two maxillary bones, left and a right. I'm going to show you actually that palatine process of the maxillary bone right here. So you can see in this diagram, the maxillary bone from the anterior view. You can see this process coming up here, again, articulating with your nasal bone, your lacrimal bone, your frontal bone. You have a couple important, actually one important foramen here too, is your infraorbital foramen, which is this hole just below your eye socket. You can also see in this diagram that you have this other fissure. I talked about the superior orbital fissure before, formed between the greater and lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. You also have this inferior orbital fissure that's formed by the space between this greater wing of the sphenoid bone and actually part of your maxillary bone here. And if we cut this away on a parasagittal plane, the other process I want you to know is this palatine process. So I said it formed the anterior portion of the hard palate. And so it's front part here. The posterior portion is formed by another bone here that I'll talk about in just a second. But that is the anterior portion of the hard palate. Oh, I made a mistake too. Earlier I said that your palate is the hard, I want to correct myself. The hard palate is actually the anterior part of your palate. The soft palate is in the back. Is that what I said before? Or did I mix it up? Yes, I said, okay, good. The hard palate is up front, formed by this palatine process of the maxillary bone, and then this other, the palatine bone here, and then the back part, once you stick your finger in and go back up here, you can feel it's really soft. It's probably pretty uncomfortable to stick your finger all the way back there. I mentioned the sphenoid bone is kind of considered the keystone bone of the skull. The maxillary bones are the keystone bones of the face. They kind of, everything articulates with them more or less. And you can see that on the diagram here. It's articulating with all those bones. They also include sinuses, which are the sinuses that are kind of right down here. Again, these are air-filled pockets within the bone, which often give you trouble when they get infected and clogged. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it forms part of the inferior orbital fissure that you see right there. And one last point. I already talked about the infraorbital foramina on the left and right side. And this foramina is a passageway for part of a cranial nerve. I don't need you to know that detail right now. Just want to throw that out there so that when we talk about cranial nerves later in the semester, you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that infraorbital foramen. That was cool. It's like my favorite foramina, my favorite foramina, you'd say. You might not have, at this point in the semester, you might not have developed your favorite foramina yet, but that will come. That will come. So that's the facial bones and the maxilla. Those are the most complicated of the facial bones. Most of the rest of these I'm going to run through pretty quickly because they're small and they don't have a lot of these different structures. The exception is going to be I get to the mandible. The mandible has a bunch of things on it that you need to know because it's this big kind of complicated bone.
When you get older and lose your teeth, does it change shape because your teeth aren't keeping separated? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it kind of has you can have a kind of like a what sort of like a domino effect where if you don't have the teeth, then your jaw doesn't close the same way, and that can affect the soft tissue and et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the zygomatic bones. These guys are the lateral portion of your cheekbones. They articulate with the frontal, temporal, and maxilla bones, and they also form the kind of inferior margin of your eye socket. This is bone right here. And that's all I'm going to say about the zygomatic bones. So essentially, you have three bones that form what we commonly refer to as your quote unquote cheekbone in common language. You have your temporal bone here, and you can feel that structure come out. If you come just from anterior to your ear and feel out here, you feel this bridge right here. That's what we commonly call your cheekbone. It's formed by part of your the zygomatic process of your temporal bone, then your zygomatic bone itself, and then the zygomatic process of your maxilla here. You can see it's actually composed of three different bones, tightly bound together. The nasal bones I talked about a little bit earlier. These are this paired bones just in the bridge of your nose here. You can see what they look like from a lateral view as well. You can see this is a nice view where kind of you can see this is probably where Voldemort's nose ended right there. Just had no soft tissue. The lacrimal bones I mentioned earlier as well. These are just paired bones. There's one feature on them I want you to know, and that's called the lacrimal fossa. And that is like a flat area where you have a lacrimal sac that connects to the eye, that collects your tears when you produce your tears. When you produce too many tears and the sac can't contain it and hold it fast enough, then that liquid drips down your cheeks. So you're kind of constantly producing tears, right? Not just when you're really sad or happy, and it's lubricating your eye. And at a normal level, though, that fluid just goes right down into the lacrimal sac and then drains into your nasal cavity. When something happens and you have an emotional response and you produce too much of this, I shouldn't say too much, you produce too much of this fluid for those sacs to handle, then it basically overflows. And that's when it comes down your cheeks. Got these paired bones called palatine bones. I talked about these a little bit earlier. So remember, this is your palate. Your hard palate here is formed by bone. The anterior portion formed by the palatine process of your maxillary bones. The posterior portion of the hard palate formed by this palatine bone, which is actually this kind of funky bone that is almost forms a right angle. Oh shoot, I don't have a picture of it here. You'll see in lab, but basically you have part of it that goes up, and that's the perpendicular plate, and part of it that goes horizontal, cleverly named the horizontal plate. And it's that horizontal plate that forms the posterior aspect of your hard palate. Please.
Is your hard palate like originally softer when you're a child?
Mhm. That's exactly it. And I'm actually going to show you. I have some diagrams here. Probably won't get to it today. We'll do it next week. But looking at a children's skull. Yep, and that bone will adjust as well. Kind of like a good example. So the palate expander is almost the same idea as that leg extension surgery that I showed you a couple of weeks ago, right? The only difference is in that case, they actually like cut the existing bone and then pull it apart. In this case, you're just pulling apart these two bones, but very gradually. But the bone, if it happens at a pace where the bone can keep up, the bone will restructure and remodel itself to fit that. I didn't have a palate expander when I'm young, but I heard that it's not fun at all. Yeah. Jada, go ahead.
Suck their thumb when they're like a child.
Mhm.
Is it make that bone shorten, like if they suck it for too long, like bone?
That's a good question. Yeah, my understanding is it can affect the development of that tissue. Whether it's the hard or soft palate, I'm not 100% sure. But I know that at a certain point, you want to not suck your thumb too much because it can affect that development. I don't know exactly how that works. Yeah, I didn't thought about that. That's a good question. Let's see here. I got to do one more bone, and then we'll get into a little bit more of your airways. We've only got a couple more here. I just want to talk about the vomer. I'm not going to say much about the vomer. It's unpaired, and it's shaped kind of like this big, more or less triangular shape that apparently resembles the plow. And so it's called the vomer. That comes from the Latin word for plow. You can see what it looks like there. Now, from the side, you can see the vomer looks like this kind of triangular, almost like arrowhead shaped bone. If we look at this from an inferior view, you can see it rests right here, and it forms part of that nasal septum. You can see it articulates here with the sphenoid bone, and then also has an articulation. This is the palatine bone here. You can see it's kind of nestled right in there. And you can see part of the vomer if you look at an anterior view of the skull. You can see it right through the nasal passageway here. So again, this is articulation with the perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone. And that's all the bones we need to cover for today. We'll finish this up on Monday, a week from today. Wow, crazy. So, oh shoot, actually, I wanted to do a little more time for this at the end of class, but we'll be okay. Real quick, I graded your quizzes from Friday. So out of a 30, the class mean was a 20.8, which is about just shy of 70%, which is certainly lower than your other assessments that were open book. That's not terribly surprising, but still within kind of a range. It's generally acceptable, for a class average. If you look at the distribution here, notice that a few of you got really high scores here. I don't think I had any perfect scores, a couple 28s. And then most of you kind of fell out in the middle, with a few of you kind of coming down here on the lower end of the scale. So make sure, again, if you're falling out on the left side of this distribution, make sure you're kind of rethinking your study habits a little bit. I still have 2 students in the class that need to take the quiz. So I'm debating. I can't really hand them back for you to keep, but I would like for you to at least have a chance to look it over. So maybe what I'll do is this. I'll put your ticket out there. I'll give people their quizzes back to take a look at, and then I'll just collect them from you on the way out. And then once everyone in the class has taken it, I'll just give them back to you. But I generally feel like it's not useful for you to receive a grade unless you see what you got right and wrong on a given assessment. So let's do that. I'll need them back. Couple other reminders real quick before I do take it out. No class program for break. Break is break. So we have lab tomorrow, of course, but if you're caught up on your work in this class, you shouldn't have any additional assignments or even reading over break. So that's cool. I do have open hours today from noon to 2. I'll be up in the lab room, so come on by if you have any questions or want to review anything for our quiz tomorrow in lab. Also, a reminder that Danny will have a tutorial session today at 6 in the lab room. Remember, you do have your quiz on the muscles of the lower limbs tomorrow. You can expect to see some cats out with pins and muscles asking what they are, as well as some human models. With that in mind, I've got to tick it out with a couple of questions. I'm going to ask you to upload your diagram. I'm going to give back your quizzes, and then I will just grab these from you on the way out.